Section 9 of the Convivio. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Convivio by Dante Alighieri, translated by Philip H. Wicksteed. Section 9, Treatise 3, Chapters 1 through 5. Chapter 1. As hath been told in the preceding treatise, my second love took its beginning from the compassionate semblance of a lady, which love afterward, finding my life disposed for its ardour, kindled after the fashion of fire, from a little flame to a great, so that, not only when I woke, but when I slept, into my head was light from her guided. And how great was the yearning which love gave me to see her, could neither be uttered nor comprehended. And not only of her was I thus desirous, but of all those persons who were in any way connected with her, whether by intimacy or by any tie of kinship. Oh, how many nights there were wherein the eyes of others were resting, closed in sleep, and mine were fixedly gazing on the abiding place of my love. And since the redoubled conflagration must needs reveal itself outwardly, because it cannot possibly remain concealed, a wish came upon me to speak of love, which I was utterly unable to restrain. And though I might have but little command over my own counsel, yet I so far approached it from time to time, either by the will of love or by my own eagerness, that I comprehended and perceived that, in speaking of love, there was no more fair nor profitable discourse than that which commended the loved person. And this deliberation was inspired by 3 reasons, of which the first was the proper love of myself, which is the beginning of all the rest, even as everyone perceives that there is no more legitimate nor more gracious method of a man doing honour to himself than by honouring his friend. For, inasmuch as friendship may not be between unlikes, wheresoever friendship is perceived, likeness is understood to be, and wheresoever likeness is understood to be, praise and blame run common. And from this argument 2 great lessons may be learnt. The one is, not to be willing that any vicious one should show himself to be our friend, because therein an evil opinion of him to whom he shows himself friendly is conceived. And the other is that no one should blame his friend publicly, because, if the preceding reason be rightly considered, he is thereby thrusting a finger into his own eye. The second reason was the desire to perpetuate this friendship, wherefore you are to know that, as saith the philosopher in the 9th of the Ethics, in the friendship of folk of unlike condition there must be, in order to preserve it, a certain proportion between them, which shall in a way reduce the unlikeness to likeness, as in the case of a master and servant. For although the servant cannot render a like benefit to his master when he receives a benefit from him, he must nevertheless render such as he best can, with so much zeal and openness, that that which is unlike in itself shall be made like by the manifestation of goodwill, which reveals and confirms and preserves the friendship. Wherefore I, reflecting upon my inferiority to this lady, and seeing myself benefited by her, resolved to commend her, according to my power. If the which be not like in itself to hers, at least my zealous will shows that, if I could do more, more would I do, and so it likens itself to that of this gentle lady. The third reason was a motive prompted by forethought, for, as says Boethius, it doth not suffice to look only upon that which is before the eyes, to wit, the present, and therefore forethought is given to us, which looks beyond, even to that which may come to pass. I mean that I reflected that by many who come after me, I might perchance be reproved for lightness of mind, when they heard that I had changed from my first love. Wherefore, to remove this blame, there was no better means than to tell of the quality of the lady who had changed me, for by the manifestation of her excellence, consideration of her power might accrue, and when her supreme power was understood, it might be thought that no stability of mind could resist being changed by her, and so I might not be deemed light or unstable. I undertook, therefore, to speak this lady's praise, and, if not in fashion as were fitting, at least so far forth as I might, and I began to say, Love that discourses to me and my mind. This ode has 3 chief parts. The first is all the first verse, wherein the discourse is by way of proem. The second is all the 3 following verses, wherein is treated that which it is the purport of the ode to utter, to wit, the praise of this gentle one. And the first of these begins, The sun seeth not, who circleth all the world. The third part is the 5th and last verse, wherein, directing my words to the ode, I purge her of a certain difficulty, and of these 3 parts we are to discourse in order. Chapter 2. Addressing myself then to the first part, which was ordained as proem of this ode, I say that we must divide it into 3 parts, for first, the ineffable quality of the theme is touched upon. Secondly, my insufficiency to deal perfectly with it is set forth. And this second part begins, "And verily it behoveth me first to drop." Finally, I excuse myself for my insufficiency, for which no fault should be found with me. And this I begin when I say, "Wherefore, if defect shall mark my rhymes," I say then, "Love that discourses to me in my mind." Where, in the first place, we are to consider who this is who discourses, and what that place is wherein I assert that he makes discourse. Love, truly taken and subtly considered, is not else than a spiritual union of the soul and of the loved thing, to which union the soul, in virtue of its own nature, runs swift or slow according as it is free or impeded. And the reason of this natural property may be that every substantial form proceeds from its own first cause, which is God, as is written in the Book of Causes, and they derive their diversities not from it, for it is most simple, but from the secondary causes or from the material upon which it descends. Wherefore in that same book, in treating of the infusion of the divine goodness, it is written, "And make the excellences and the gifts diverse, in virtue of the cooperation of the thing which receives." Wherefore, inasmuch as every effect retains something of the nature of its cause, as Alpetragius says, when he affirms that what is caused by a circular body has, in a certain fashion, a circular existence, every form possesses, in a fashion, the existence of the divine nature, not that the divine nature is divided and communicated to them, but it is participated by them, something after the mode wherein the sun is by participation in the other stars. And the more noble the form is, the more does it retain of this nature. Wherefore the human soul, which is the noblest form of all those that are generated beneath the heaven, receives more of the divine nature than any other. And since it is most germane to the nature of God to will to be, because, as we read in the aforesaid book, being comes first of all, and before that there is not, the human soul naturally desires, with the whole force of its longing, to be. And because its being depends on God, and by him is preserved, it naturally desires and wills to be united to God in order to fortify its own being. And because it is in the excellences of nature that the divine principle reveals itself, it comes to pass that the human soul naturally unites herself with them in spiritual fashion, the more swiftly and the more mightily in proportion as they appear more perfect. And they so appear in proportion as the soul's power of recognition is clear or obstructed. In this union it is which we call love, whereby the inner quality of the soul may be recognized by examining outwardly the things which it loves. This love, to wit the union of my soul with this gentle lady, in whom full much of the divine light was revealed to me, is he who discourses, and of whom I speak, because from him unbroken thoughts had birth, by gazing and pondering upon the worth of this lady, who is spiritually made one thing with my soul. The place wherein I say that he discoursed is the mind, but to say that it is the mind gives us no more understanding of it than before, and therefore we are to examine what this word mind properly signifies. I say then that the philosopher in the second of the soul, when analyzing its powers, says that the soul has in the main 3 powers, to wit, life, sense, and reason, and he also mentions motion, but this may be united with sense, for every soul that has sense, either with all the senses or some one of them only, has motion also, so that motion is a power inseparable from sense. And as he says, it is quite plain that these powers are so related to each other that one is the foundation of the other, and that which is the foundation may exist by itself apart, but the other which is founded upon it may not exist apart from it. Wherefore the vegetative power, whereby things live, is the foundation upon which rests the sensitive life, to wit, sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. And this vegetative power may constitute a soul in itself, as we see in all the plants. The sensitive power cannot exist without this. There is nothing that feels without being alive, and this sensitive power is the foundation of the intellectual power, to wit, the reason. And therefore, amongst mortal things that have life, the rational power without the sensitive is not to be found, but the sensitive power is to be found without the other, as we see in the beasts and in the birds and in the fishes and in every brute animal. And that soul which embraces all these powers is the most perfect of all the rest. And the human soul, which is associated with the nobility of the highest power, to wit, reason, participates in the divine nature after the fashion of an eternal intelligence, because the soul is so ennobled and stripped of material in this sovereign power that the divine light shines in it as an angel. And therefore man has been called by the philosophers the divine animal. In this most noble part of the soul exist many faculties, as says the philosopher, especially in the 6th of the Ethics, where he says that there is a capacity in it which is called scientific, and another which is called ratiocinative or counseling. And together with this are certain faculties, as Aristotle says in that same place, such as the inventive faculty and the judicial. And all these most noble faculties, and the rest that abide in this excellent power, are called collectively by this name, as to the meaning of which we are inquiring, to wit, mind. whereby it is manifest that by mind we understand this highest and most noble part of the soul, and that this is the meaning is seen from the fact that it is only of man and of the divine substances that this mind is predicated, as may be plainly seen from Boethius, who first predicates it of men, when he says to philosophy, "Thou and God who placed thee in the minds of men," and afterwards predicates it of God, when he says to God, "Thou dost produce all things after supernal pattern, O thou most beauteous, bearing the beauteous world in thy mind." Nor ever was it predicated of a brute animal. Nay, rather there are many men who seem lacking in this most perfect part, of whom it seems that we neither should nor can predicate it, and therefore such are called in grammar amenti and dementi, that is, without mind. So now we can see what is that mind, which is the culmination and the most precious part of the soul, which is deity. And this is the place wherein I declare that love discourseth to me of my lady. Chapter 3. Not without cause do I say that this love plies his operation in my mind, but this is said with reason to give to understand what manner of love this is, by telling of the place wherein it operates. Wherefore be it known that everything, as said above, and for the reason above set forth, hath its specific love, as, for example, the simple bodies have a love which has an innate affinity to their proper place, and that is why earth ever drops to the centre, but the love of fire is for the upper circumference, under the heaven of the moon, and therefore it ever riseth thereto. Primary compound bodies, like the minerals, have a love for the place where their generation is ordained, and therein they grow, and thence draw vigour and power, whence we see the magnet ever receive power from the direction of its generation. Plants, which are the primary living things, have a more manifest love for certain places, according as their composition requires, and therefore we see certain plants almost always gather along watercourses, and certain on the ridges of mountains, and certain on slopes and at the foot of hills, the which, if we transplant them, either die altogether or live as if in gloom, like things parted from the place dear to them. As for the brute animals, not only have they a more manifest love for their place, but we see that they love one another. Men have their proper love for perfect and comely things, and because man, though his whole form be one sole substance, has in himself by his nobility something of the nature of each of these things, he may have all these loves, and has them all indeed. For in virtue of the nature of the simple body, which predominates in the subject, he naturally loves to descend, and therefore when he moves his body upward it is more toilsome. By the second nature of a complex body, he loves the place and further the time of his generation, and therefore every one is naturally of more efficient body at the place where he was generated, and at the time of his generation, than at any other. Wherefore we read in the stories of Hercules and in the great Ovid and in Lucan and in other poets that, when he was fighting with the giant called Antaeus, whenever the giant failed, and his body was stretched upon the earth, whether of his own will or by the might of Hercules, force and vigour rose up again in him, renovated by the earth, wherein and wherefrom he had been generated. Perceiving which, Hercules, at the last, grasping him and lifting him from the earth, held him so long and suffered him not to reunite himself with the earth, that with overmastery he conquered and slew him. In this battle was in Africa, according to the testimony of the Scriptures. And by the third nature, to wit, that of plants, man hath love for certain food, not in so far as it affects the sense, but in so far as it is nutritious, and such food maketh the working of this nature most perfect, and other food does not so, but makes it imperfect. And therefore we see that some certain food shall make men fair of face and stout of limb, and of a lively colour, and certain other shall work the contrary of this. And in virtue of the fourth nature, that of animals, to wit the sensitive, man hath another love, whereby he loveth according to sensible appearance, like to a beast. And this is the love in man which most needeth a ruler, because of its overmastering operation, especially in the delight of taste and touch. And by the fifth and last nature, that is to say, the truly human, or rather say, the angelic, to wit the rational, man hath love to truth and to virtue. And from this love springeth the true and perfect friendship, drawn from nobility, whereof the philosopher speaks in the 8th of the Ethics, when he treats of friendship. Wherefore, inasmuch as this nature is called mind, as shown above, I declare that love discoursed in my mind, to give to understand that this love was that which is native to this most noble nature, to wit, the love of truth and of virtue, and to exclude every false opinion concerning me, whereby my love might have been suspected to be love for delight of sense. And then I say yearningly to give to understand its continuity and its fervour. And I say that he often moveth things which make my intellect lose its way. And I speak truth, because my thoughts, when discoursing of her, often strove to bring things to an issue about her which I might not comprehend. And I was all astray, so that outwardly I appeared as though distraught, like to a man who looks with his sight along a straight line, and first clearly sees the things nighest to him. Then, as he goes on, sees them less clearly, then further on is at a loss concerning them. Then going on even to the furthest of all, his sight is unfocused, and he sees not. And this is the one source of the unutterableness of that which I have taken as my theme. And then, in sequence, I tell of the other, when I say, his discourse, and the rest. And I say that my thoughts, which are the discourse of love, have sweet sound, that my soul, that is, my affection, burns to be able to relate this with the tongue. And because I may not tell it, I say that the soul laments thereat, saying, O me, that I have not power. And this is the other source of unutterableness, namely, that the tongue cannot completely follow that which the intellect perceives. And I say, the soul that heareth him and feeleth, heareth as touching the words, and feeleth as touching the sweetness of sound. Chapter 4. Having discoursed of the twofold unutterableness of this subject matter, it is fitting to proceed to tell of my own insufficiency. I say then that my insufficiency hath a twofold origin, even as the loftiness of that lady hath a twofold transcendency, after the fashion expounded. For though poverty of intellect needs must drop much of that which is true concerning her, and which raise in some sort into my mind, which, like a transparent body, receives without arresting it. And this I say in this following clause, and verily it behoveth me first to drop. And when I say, and of that which it understandeth, I assert that not only am I insufficient for that which my intellect cannot support, but even for that which I understand, because my tongue hath not such eloquence as to be able to utter the discourse which is held of her in my thought. Whereby it is seen that, in proportion to the truth, that which I shall say will be but little, and the outcome of this is greatly to her praise if rightly considered, and that is the main purpose. And that discourse, which at every point has its hand on the main purpose, may well be said to come from the workshop of the rhetorician. Then, where it says, Wherefore, if defect shall mark my rhymes, I excuse myself for my fault, for which, when folks see that my words are beneath her dignity, I ought not to be blamed. And I say that if there be defect in my rhymes, that is to say, in my words, which are ordained to treat of her, the blame must fall upon the weakness of intellect and the scant power of our speech, which is vanquished by the thought, so that it may scarce follow it, especially where the thought springs from love, because there the soul exercises herself more profoundly than elsewhere. It might be said, thou art excusing and at the same time accusing thyself, for it is a conviction of blame, and not a purgation from it, in so far as the blame is thrown upon the intellect and upon speech, which are mine, so that if the same be good, I ought to be praised therefore to the extent of the goodness, and if defective, to be blamed. To this it may be answered briefly that I do not accuse myself, but do genuinely excuse myself. And here too be it known that, according to the philosopher in the third of the Ethics, man deserves praise or blame only for those things which it is in his power to do or not to do, but in those things wherein he has no power, he deserves neither praise nor blame, inasmuch as both are to be rendered to some other, albeit the things themselves be part of the very man. Wherefore we should not blame a man because of a body deformed from his birth, because it was not in his power to make himself beautiful, but we are to blame the faulty disposition of the material whereof he was made, which was the source of the failure of nature. And in like manner we should not praise a man for any beauty of body which he may have from his birth, for he was not the maker thereof, but we ought to praise the artificer, to wit, human nature, which produces such great beauty in its material when it is not impeded by it. And therefore the priest well answered the emperor who laughed and scoffed at his deformity of body, God is the Lord, he made us, and not we ourselves. And these are the words of the prophet in a verse of the Psalter, written as they stand in the priest's answer, without addition or subtraction. And therefore let the ill-conditioned wretches look to it, who make it all their study to deck out their person, which should be treated with all dignity, for this is not else than to ornament the work of another and neglect one's own. Returning then to the purpose, I affirm that our intellect, by defect of that power whence it draws whatsoever it contemplates, which is an organic power, to wit, the fantasy, may not rise to certain things, because the fantasy may not aid it, for it hath not wherewithal. Such are the substances sejunct from matter, which, even though a certain consideration of them be possible, we may not understand nor comprehend perfectly. And for this a man is not to blame, for he was not the maker of this deficiency. Nay, rather it is the work of universal nature, that is, of God, who willed that we should lack such light in this life. And why he did this it were presumptuous to argue, so that if my consideration transported me into a region where fantasy failed the intellect, I am not to blame for not being able to understand. Further, a limit is fixed for our intelligence in each one of its operations, not by us, but by universal nature, and therefore be it known that the limits of intelligence are wider in thought than in speech, and wider in speech than in signals. Therefore, if our thought surpasses speech, not only in matters which attain not to perfect understanding, but also in those which only just attain to it, we are not to blame for this, because it is not we who make it so. And thus I show that my excuse is a genuine one, when I say, for this let our feeble intellect be blamed, and our speech, which hath not power to tell again all that love telleth. For the good will should be right clearly seen, and this is what we ought to consider in the matter of human deserts. This, then, is how we are to understand the first chief section of this ode which is at hand. Now that the discussion of the first section has revealed its meaning, we are duly to proceed to the second, whereof, for its better inspection, 3 divisions should be made according as it is embraced in 3 verses. For in the first I commend this lady in her entirety and without distinction, alike in soul and in body. In the second I come down to the special praise of the soul, and in the third to the special praise of the body. The first division begins, "The sun seeth not who circleth all the world." The second begins, "On her descendeth the divine power." The third begins, "Things are revealed in her aspect." And these divisions are to be discussed in order. I say then, "The sun seeth not who circleth all the world," wherein, for perfect understanding, we must know how the world is circled by the sun. In the first place, I say that by the world I do not here understand the whole body of the universe, but only this region of sea and land, according to the common speech, which uses so to call it. Just as one says, "Such a one has seen all the world," meaning the region of sea and land. Pythagoras and his followers declared that this world was one of the stars, and that there was another of like fashion opposite to it. And this they called Antichthon, and he said that they were both on one sphere, which turned from east to west, and that it was in virtue of this revolution that the sun circled round us and was now visible and now invisible. And he said that fire was betwixt these two, laying it down that it was a nobler substance than water and than earth, laying it down that the centre was the noblest among the places of the 4 simple bodies. And therefore he said that fire, when it seemed to rise, was really descending to its own centre. Afterwards Plato adopted another opinion, and wrote in a book of his which is called Timaeus, that the earth with the sea was really the centre of the whole, but that its whole globe turned round on its centre, following the primal movement of heaven, but very slowly, because of its gross material and because of its extreme distance from that primal movement. These opinions are refuted as false in the second, of heaven and earth, by that glorious philosopher to whom nature opened her secrets more than to any other. And by him it is there shown that this world, to wit the earth, stands forever stable and fixed in herself. In the proofs which Aristotle enunciates to crush these others and to establish the truth, it is not my purpose here to relate, because it is enough for those whom I am addressing to be assured on his great authority that this earth is fixed and revolves not, and that it, together with the ocean, is the centre of the heaven. This heaven revolves round this centre, as we perceive, without break, in the revolution of which there must needs be 2 fixed poles, and a circle equally distant from them both, which revolves most rapidly. Of these 2 poles, the one, that is to say this northern one, is apparent to almost all the land which is uncovered. The other, to wit the southern one, is concealed from almost all the uncovered land. The circle which is perceived midway between them is that path of the heaven under which the sun revolves when he goes in company with the ram, or with the scales. Wherefore be it known that if a stone should fall from this our pole, it would fall, away yonder, into the ocean, right upon the hump of the sea, at the spot where, if there were a man, he would always have the star right above his head. And I suppose that from Rome to this spot, measuring straight to the north, there would be a space of some 2,600 miles, or a little more or less. Let us imagine, then, for a better understanding, that there be a city on that spot which I have named, and that it be called Maria. I say further that if a stone should fall from that other pole, that is, the southern one, it would fall upon that hump of the ocean sea which is exactly opposite to Maria on this ball. And I suppose that from Rome to the place where that second stone would fall, measuring straight to the south, would be a space of 6,500 miles, a little more or less. And here let us imagine another city, and let it be called Lucia, and the space, in whatever direction we draw the cord, would be 10,200 miles between the one and the other, just half the circumference of this ball, so that citizens of Maria would have their feet opposed to the feet of those of Lucia. Let us further imagine a circle upon this ball, which at every point should be the same distance from Maria as from Lucia. I suppose that this circle, as I understand by the teachings of the astrologers, and by that of Albert of Germany in his book Of the Nature of Places, and of the Properties of the Elements, and also by the testimony of Lucan in his 9th book, would divide this uncovered land from the ocean, down there towards the south, almost along the whole extremity of the first climate, where are, amongst other nations, the Garamanti, who are almost always naked, to whom Cato came with the people of Rome, fleeing the lordship of Caesar. When we have marked these 3 places upon this ball, it is easy to perceive how the sun circleth it. I say then that the heaven of the sun revolves from west to east, not directly counter to the diurnal movement, that is, the movement of day and night, but obliquely against it, so that its mid-circle, which lies symmetrically between its poles, whereon is the body of the sun, cuts the circle of the 2 first poles, at 2 opposite points, to wit, at the beginning of the ram and at the beginning of the scales, and it departs from it along 2 arcs, one toward the north and the other toward the south. And the summits of these arcs depart equally from the first circle on either side by 23 degrees and a point more, and one summit is the beginning of the crab, and the other is the beginning of Capricorn. Wherefore, at the beginning of the ram, when the sun travels beneath the mid-circle of the first poles, Maria must needs see him circling the world around, down upon the earth, or the ocean, like a millstone, from which not more than half of his body should appear. And she would see him continually rising after the manner of the screw of a press, until he had completed 91 revolutions and a little more. When these revolutions are completed, his elevation at Maria is about as much as it is for us at mid-tierce, when the day and night are equal. And if a man were standing erect in Maria, with his face ever turned to the sun, he would see it ever moving toward his right hand. Then, following the same path, he seems to descend for another 91 circlings and a little more until he is circling around, down upon the earth or the sea, not displaying his whole bulk. And then he passes out of sight, and Lucia begins to see him, and perceives him mounting and descending around her as many circles as Maria does. And if a man were standing erect at Lucia, and ever turning his face toward the sun, he would see him moving toward his left hand, whereby it may be perceived that these places have one day in the year 6 months long, and a night of equal time, and when the one has day, the other night. Again, it follows that the circle upon this ball where, as already stated, the Garamanti are, must see the sun circling right above it, not after the fashion of a millstone, but of a wheel, not more than half of which can be seen in any region, when the sun is travelling under the ram. And then it perceives him departing from itself, and working towards Maria 91 days and a little more, and returning towards itself for as many days. And then, when he has come back, he travels beneath the scales, and again departs and approaches Lucia 91 days and a little more, and returns during as many. And this locality, which girds the whole ball, always has the day equal to the night, whichever side of it the sun is travelling, and it has twice in the year a most fierce summer of heat, and 2 little winters. It follows further that the 2 spaces intermediate between the 2 imagined cities in the mid-circle must see the sun in varied fashion according as they are remote or nigh to these places, as may now, by what has been said, be perceived by whosoever hath a noble intellect, to which it is well to leave a little effort. Wherefore it may now be seen that, by divine provision, the world is so ordained that when the sphere of the sun has revolved and returned to any point, this ball, on which we are placed, has received in its every region an equal time of light and of darkness. O unutterable wisdom that didst thus ordain, how poor is our mind to comprehend thee! And ye for whose behoof and delight I am writing, in what blindness do ye live, not lifting up your eyes to these things, but keeping them fixed upon the mire of your folly. End of section 9.